Soft piano music plays. Evening ambiance fades in. The sound of crickets, distant traffic, and a weary sigh. Mrs. Collins had always been the kind of woman who carried the weight of others' problems before her own. As a middle school teacher, she wasn't just teaching. She was mentoring, guiding, and sometimes even parenting the children who crossed her classroom. Her mornings began before the first ray of sunlight kissed the neighborhood rooftops. The aroma of fresh coffee filled her small kitchen as she reviewed lesson plans, graded papers, and prepared herself for another long day. By the time the final school bell rang, her smile was still there, tired but sincere. That day, however, had been longer than usual. A parent-teacher conference had stretched hours into the evening, and each conversation took another little piece of her energy. When she finally stepped out of the empty school building, the sun was gone, and the air was thick with the chill of exhaustion. Her car hummed quietly as she drove through the neighborhood streets, each turn bringing her closer to rest. But as she turned into Maplewood Drive, something instantly deflated her brief sense of relief. Her driveway, the small patch of concrete that she called her own, was already occupied. Her teenage son, Ethan, had returned home early from soccer practice and parked there, probably forgetting that his mom would need the space later. It wasn't his fault, not really, just a simple mistake. She slowed down, glancing left and right. Every other spot along the street was full. The community was alive even at this late hour. Cars lined both sides of the road, porch lights flickered, and the soft hum of television seeped from nearby homes. Mrs. Collins sighed. "Just one night," she murmured to herself, spotting the visitor parking area near the community park. The lot was practically empty. Only one car sat there, covered in dew and dust. It didn't seem like a big deal. She parked her sedan neatly, checked her mirrors twice, and locked the doors. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to exhale. "It's fine," she whispered, heading toward her house under the gentle glow of the street lamps. Just for tonight. The world was quiet, the kind of peaceful quiet only tired people notice. She made herself a quick cup of tea, kissed her son goodnight, and sank into the couch. She didn't think twice about the car again, but peace in an HOA community, as she was about to learn, is fragile. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with its usual rhythm. Sprinklers ticked across manicured lawns. Dogs barked at joggers, and the hum of garage doors echoed down the block. Mrs. Collins walked out, holding her coffee mug, ready to drive off to another busy day. And then she saw it. A bright orange notice flapped beneath her windshield wiper. Bold, official, and almost shouting through the silence of the morning. Violation of HOA Rule 12B. Visitor parking for visitors only. Her eyebrows furrowed. For a moment, she thought it might be a prank. She looked around, half expecting someone to jump out laughing, but the street was empty. Only the distant whir of a lawnmower answered her. She peeled the paper off carefully, scanning the fine print. It listed the rule, the time of the violation, and a warning that repeated offenses could lead to fines. Mrs. Collins chuckled nervously. "Okay, someone's got too much time on their hands," she said under her breath, crumpling the notice and tossing it on the passenger seat. Surely the HOA wouldn't be that strict over one harmless night, but 3 days later, it happened again. This time, she had come home after a late faculty meeting. Her driveway was clear, but she'd parked in the visitor spot again out of habit, just for a few hours. When she went out the next morning, there it was, another orange notice, same words, same rule. Same tone of quiet authority. She sighed, frustration bubbling beneath her calm exterior. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, glancing around. A few houses away, a man was trimming his hedge. He glanced up, gave her a sympathetic shrug, and went back to his work. Mrs. Collins decided to let it go. Maybe it was automated. Maybe someone on the HOA was just doing their job too seriously. But then came the third one. It was Thursday morning when she found it. Not just the notice this time, but an envelope. Inside was a printed letter from the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association, complete with an official logo and her name neatly typed at the top. It read, "Dear resident, you have been found in repeated violation of HOA Parking Policy Rule 12B. As per community guidelines, a fine of $75 has been issued to your account. Further non-compliance may result in towing or legal action. Mrs. Collins stood there in disbelief, the letter trembling in her hands. She wasn't an angry person by nature, but something about the tone, the coldness of it, hit a nerve. 75 dollars for parking in an empty space. She looked toward the visitor lot. Again, empty. Not a single car in sight. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the principle. The letter felt less like a warning and more like an accusation, like she'd done something immoral. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, the notice lying flat beside her half-eaten dinner. Her son, noticing her expression, asked, "Mom, what's wrong?" She smiled faintly. "Just community politics, sweetheart." But deep inside, she felt something stir, a mix of confusion and quiet rebellion. All her life, she had followed rules, respected authority, and believed in fairness. But now, standing in her own home, in a neighborhood she'd chosen for peace and safety, she felt powerless. For the first time, the walls around her didn't feel like home. They felt like boundaries, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mrs. Collins made a quiet decision. She would not ignore this anymore. She would attend the next HOA meeting and speak up, because sometimes change begins not with anger, but with exhaustion. Soft music fades out as the screen dims, ending scene 1. The HOA board at Maplewood was known for one thing above all: order. Not kindness, not flexibility, just order. Their motto, printed on every newsletter and notice board, proudly declared, "We maintain harmony through structure." To outsiders, it sounded noble. But to the people who actually lived under those rules, it often felt like living under constant surveillance. The Maplewood HOA office stood at the corner of the community park, a neat little brick building with white shutters and a small flag fluttering in the wind. Inside, it smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. The walls were lined with framed certificates that read Community of Excellence, but to many residents, it was a reminder of control, not excellence. Their rule book was infamous. Over. 60 pages long, bound in a fake leather cover, and distributed to every homeowner when they moved in. It covered everything from the color of your mailbox, to the angle of your garden lights, to how long your grass could grow before you got a warning letter. It was bureaucracy, disguised as beauty. And among all those pages, there was one rule the board seemed to love more than any other: the parking rule. Residents must use designated driveways or garages. Visitor parking is for guests only. Violations will result in fines. Simple words. But those few lines had caused more anger, arguments, and letters than any other policy in Maplewood's history. To the HOA board, it was a rule that symbolized fairness. To the residents, it felt like a leash, tight and unnecessary. When Mrs. Collins received her third parking violation in 1 week, she felt something inside her snap. She had always been patient, soft-spoken, the kind of neighbor who waved at everyone and baked cookies during the holidays. But this time, she wasn't going to just sigh and move on. She decided to go straight to the source, the next HOA meeting. That Thursday evening, the meeting hall filled up with residents, some there to complain, others just curious. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A long table stood at the front, where the board members sat like judges behind nameplates. At the center sat Mr. Dale, the HOA president, a man known for his polished shoes, his neat hair, and his absolute belief in the power of rules. When Mrs. Collins took her seat in the back row, she clutched her folder of violation notices and took a deep breath. Her heart was racing, not from anger, but from the weight of finally speaking up. When her name was called, she stood. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but it steadied as she spoke. "I'm not breaking the spirit of the rule," she began, looking directly at the board. "I just need a place to park when I come home late from school. The visitor lot is empty most nights. Can't we be flexible?" Her words hung in the air. For a brief second, the room was silent. A few neighbors nodded quietly. They knew exactly what she meant. They'd faced the same frustration at some point. But Mr. Dale didn't move. He didn't even look up immediately. He simply flipped through his clipboard, glanced at the page, and said, Rules exist for a reason, Mrs. Collins. If we make exceptions for one, we make chaos for all. His tone wasn't cruel. It was cold, mechanical, like he'd practiced that line for years. Mrs. Collins took a slow breath. She didn't want to argue, but something about his indifference, that dismissive, bureaucratic calm, pushed her to say more. With all due respect, she said softly, harmony doesn't come from rules. It comes from understanding. The parking lot is empty every night. No one is harmed if I use it. Isn't the purpose of this community to make life easier, not harder? The audience shifted. People looked at one another. Someone whispered, "She's right." Another muttered, "They fine us for everything these days." For the first time, Mr. Dale's confidence flickered. He looked around at the other board members. Ms. Tracy, the secretary, bit her lip. Mr. Whitman, the treasurer, avoided eye contact altogether. It was clear. They had all heard similar complaints before. But saying rules are rules was easier than admitting the rules themselves might be wrong. The silence stretched on. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner. Mrs. Collins stood quietly, waiting, not challenging, just hoping for a little humanity. Finally, Mr. Dale cleared his throat and leaned forward. Mrs. Collins, we appreciate your situation, but flexibility leads to inconsistency, and inconsistency leads to complaints. The board's duty is to maintain order, not convenience. It was a statement, not a discussion. But something had changed. The people in the room, tired parents, retired couples, and first-time homeowners, looked at each other and felt it. That moment when rules start to feel like walls. Mrs. Collins nodded politely, sat down, and said nothing more. But inside, she knew this wasn't the end. That meeting had lit a quiet spark, one that would soon spread through the neighborhood. When the meeting ended, the board members filed out in silence, but behind them, whispers began. "I got fined for a guest parking overnight last week," said one man. "They fined my daughter for leaving her bike outside," said another. By the time Mrs. Collins walked back to her car, the same one still parked in the visitor's spot, the murmurs had turned into conversations. People weren't afraid to talk anymore. They were starting to question why simple human needs were being buried under pages of printed rules. And though Mr. Dale didn't realize it yet, Maplewood had just experienced its first crack in the wall of control. It didn't look like much, just a tired teacher asking for understanding. But sometimes, that's exactly where revolutions begin. News spread through Maplewood like sparks carried by the wind, quiet at first, but unstoppable once it caught. It started with whispers at the mailbox and turned into full-blown debates in driveways. Mrs. Collins's small act, parking in a visitor spot after a long, tiring day, had somehow become everyone's business. Within hours, screenshots of the HOA notice circulated through neighborhood group chats. Some residents defended her passionately. "She's a teacher, for heaven's sake. She deserves a little grace." Others, clutching their printed rule books, argued the opposite. Rules are rules. If she can ignore them, what's the point of having an HOA? By the weekend, the neighborhood had split into invisible teams. One group, mostly younger families, talked about compassion, community, and understanding. The other, older, long-term homeowners, spoke about discipline, consistency, and how bending one rule today could break the whole system tomorrow. Then came the storm on social media. The local community app exploded overnight. Post after post appeared, "HOA goes too far again." If she can park anywhere, what's next? Broken fences and messy lawns. "We pay dues for peace, not dictatorship." The digital argument spilled into the real world. Neighbors who once waved every morning now looked away. Friendly nods turned into cold silence. Kids who once rode bikes together were told, "Don't go near that house." Even the mail carrier said the air felt heavier, all over one thing, a single parking space. What was once Maplewood's pride, its sense of unity and peace, had cracked. The fences were still standing, the lawns still perfect, but beneath that surface harmony, the neighborhood had quietly turned against itself. The chatter around the neighborhood had grown too loud to ignore, and the HOA decided it was time to act. Instead of calming things down, however, they did the opposite. They tightened their grip. Within a week, every resident of Maplewood received an official notice in their mailbox. The letter, printed on crisp white paper and signed by Mr. Dale himself, read, "Effective immediately. Any improper parking will result in towing without prior warning. The HOA will take all necessary steps to maintain community standards." It was meant to sound professional and firm, but to many, it felt like a threat, a declaration of control. Mr. Dale believed this was leadership. To him, strength meant order, and order meant respect. If people see we're strict, he told the board, they'll fall back in line. But what he didn't realize was that the neighborhood wasn't falling in line. It was quietly turning against him. Almost overnight, residents began acting differently. People started snapping pictures of every car that seemed even slightly out of place. Some went as far as writing anonymous complaints, sliding them under the HOA office door after dark. The sound of phone cameras clicking replaced the sound of friendly conversation. Fear had replaced trust. One evening, a young boy was seen whispering to his friend near the mailbox. "Don't park your bike there," he said, eyes wide. "HOA might take it too." What had once been a running joke among adults was now a genuine fear even children felt. Evening walks felt heavier now. The once welcoming community patrols who used to wave and chat now drove slowly with flashlights scanning driveways, not for safety but for violations. The cheerful faces of neighbors had hardened into expressions of suspicion. And in the middle of it all, Mrs. Collins felt the shift more than anyone. As she walked past the HOA meeting hall one chilly evening, she could feel eyes following her. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Whispers started as soon as she passed. She wasn't Mrs. Collins the teacher anymore. She had become something else, a symbol of defiance, a target of resentment. The sound of her heels on the pavement echoed through the still air, mixing with the faint hum of porch lights and the rustling of blinds. The sense of belonging she once felt in Maplewood was gone. And for the first time, she began to wonder, was this really a community, or just a neighborhood ruled by fear? It was a Friday night when the real storm finally hit, not of rain or thunder, but of flashing red and blue lights that cut through the calm suburban darkness. At first, people thought there'd been an accident, but as the rumble of heavy engines grew louder and the metallic clank of chains filled the air, confusion turned into horror. One by one, tow trucks rolled into Maplewood like an invading army. Their flashing lights bounced off the houses, reflecting on windows and cars, as if the entire neighborhood had suddenly been turned into a scene from a crime drama. Within minutes, they began their work, methodical, mechanical, merciless. Cars were lifted from visitor spots, driveways, and even from curbs that were barely a few inches out of alignment. The tow operators didn't argue, didn't explain. They just followed orders. Mrs. Collins was still awake when she heard the noise outside her window. The roar of an engine, the metallic screech of a winch tightening. She ran out barefoot, still wearing her work clothes, her heart racing as she saw her car, her old blue sedan, being raised off the ground. "Wait, please stop!" she shouted, waving her arms as she ran toward the tow truck. "I'm right here. This is unfair." The driver didn't even look at her for long. He pointed to his clipboard and said flatly, "HOA orders, ma'am." Nothing personal. But to her, it was personal. Neighbors started pouring out of their homes, half in pajamas, half in disbelief. The air filled with angry voices, some shouting at the tow drivers, others yelling at each other. A few tried to reason, but their words were drowned out by the grinding noise of engines and the hiss of hydraulics. By midnight, at least a dozen cars had been hauled away. Some residents stood silently on their lawns, arms folded, faces lit by the harsh glare of flashing lights. Others filmed the chaos on their phones, posting live updates to the local community app. Within hours, the digital world exploded. Posts flooded in under a new tag, Tow Night. "Maplewood's gone mad," one user wrote. "This isn't order. It's oppression," said another. Meanwhile, the HOA office phone rang endlessly. The voicemail box filled up. Mr. Dale's inbox overflowed with complaints, subject lines like "unlawful action," "you've gone too far," and "you just lost this community." But by the time he read them, the damage had already been done. The perfect neighborhood of Maplewood was no longer perfect. What began as an attempt to preserve harmony had turned into a symbol of control and resentment. and standing in the middle of it all was Mrs. Collins, eyes wide, voice trembling, realizing that something much larger than a parking violation had been set in motion. This wasn't about cars anymore. It was about freedom, dignity, and the simple right to live without fear in your own home. The storm had come and gone, but its scars, both on the streets and in the hearts of the residents, were only just beginning to show. It was a Friday night when the real storm finally hit, not of rain or thunder, but of flashing red and blue lights that cut through the calm suburban darkness. At first, people thought there'd been